Mark Rogers TV going position by position through the Virginia Tech Hokies. And of course, to do so, we need to bring in Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC. We've talked quarterbacks, Mike. Now we're going to look at running backs. And it's an interesting situation, not necessarily a stable situation. You know who the number one guy is going to be. But a fan favorite has moved on, and Sam Rogers caught 72 passes in a very distinguished career there in Blacksburg, and 11 touchdowns, but a guy that was just a guy that could do a lot of things as a fullback that could catch the ball, run the ball, and, of course, block.
Yeah, and he wasn't necessarily used as much in the running role as some of the fans truthfully would have liked, just because of what he was doing with the ball in his hands, both out of the backfield and as a runner. But Sam Rogers was a really valuable member of the Hokies throughout his entire time in Blacksburg. Former walk-on, earned a scholarship, definite fan favorite, a guy that worked really hard and was excellent in pass protection as well. A guy who's about 5'10", like 240 pounds. So he could really lay the lumber if he had to with some of the top pass rushers in the ACC coming after his quarterbacks. So he was a guy who was invaluable in that role. As a runner, he had a little bit of wiggle to him. He was obviously more of a power back just because of his size, but he was a guy that could make some people miss in the open field, and he demonstrated that not only as a runner, but when he would catch some of the passes out of the backfield. He had a couple of huge catches throughout the season. The one against Miami where he kind of got loose and ran through the secondary was one of the more comical plays of the season, because you generally don't see a guy his size making people miss in the secondary that are 4- and 5-star recruits. So Sam Rogers is a guy who's kind of been an underdog his whole career, and he's going to move on to the NFL. Not sure if he'll be drafted, but it'll be hard to believe if he doesn't latch on somewhere in a camp. He's a hard-nosed guy who's just a really good football player. And the Hokies will definitely miss him heading into next season, just given everything he brings to the table from a leadership standpoint, as well as what he brought as a football player.
Marshawn Williams broke onto the scene as a freshman with a nice initial season, 475 yards, missed a season, came back last season. His first game in the lineup against Boston College, nice effort with 81 yards rushing, but really just couldn't stay on the field, continued to get hurt, and seriously, the last time we saw Marshawn Williams was against Notre Dame with 8 rushes for 28 yards in mid-November, and never saw him again, and unfortunately never will see him again on a football field.
Yeah, so Marshawn Williams ended up retiring here in the offseason, announcing that, the third knee injury was enough. It was another ACL issue. He's fought multiple ACL issues throughout his time at Virginia Tech. It ended his freshman year prematurely. Last year he dealt with it, and then he dealt with it the year before that. As a sophomore, he came back from the initial ACL injury and kind of came back too soon and didn't really make an impact as a sophomore. So was able to take a medical redshirt, which led him to this past season where, he was finally back healthy, but in his redshirt sophomore season, he blows out his knee again in the Notre Dame game and unfortunately had to retire. A guy that was really starting to gain steam in the Virginia Tech backfield, the longer the season went on, the more carries he was getting. So it was clear that he was starting to establish more of a role for himself in Justin Fuente's offense. And he's a guy who wasn't obviously a prototypical running back for that system, not a guy that made a lot of people miss, a big-time power back, more in the role of Sam Rogers, but, a little bit faster. So Williams was getting more of a look later in the season along with Sam Rogers, and we saw a little bit less of Travon McMillian, who we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, it's a bummer to see Marshawn Williams, essentially turn into a player coach now at this point for the remainder of his time in Blacksburg. Obviously was a hard-nosed runner with a lot of potential. And then one other guy that is moving on is Shai McKenzie, announced that he would transfer. And Mark, he was a guy, if you remember, his freshman year, came in with Marshawn Williams, split carries with Williams and J.C. Coleman, who was the incumbent running back at the time. And the three of them had a nice thing going, but Shai McKenzie, much like Marshawn Williams, also tore his ACL, battled knee injuries the following season. Another situation where he also came back too soon from the knee injury, medical redshirt, came back this past season healthy, but didn't really establish a role for himself. Ended up missing the bowl game with a shoulder injury. So the last time we saw him was in the regular season. So Shy McKenzie has transferred. He's moved on. Never really got into favor with this coaching staff in a clear role as a rotation player at the running back position. Served more of a role on special teams once Justin Fuente came back. Some of that could have been due to injury. Some of it just might have been due to him losing a step due to knee issues. We won't know really until he finally decides where he will go in his next destination, see if he can carve out a role for himself there. Rumors are that he might end up somewhere in the state of Pennsylvania. He's originally from Pittsburgh and was recruited to play for the Panthers before he ultimately decided to commit to the Hokies. So best of luck to him as well.
Travon McMillian, a guy that burst onto the scene with 1,000 yards rushing and 7 touchdowns as a freshman, an explosive guy who at the time in a run-oriented offense obviously was the guy. Last season, though, it's funny because if we think back to our conversation we had breaking down the quarterbacks as the passing game developed and Gerard Evans started to take hold with a bevy of very talented wide receivers, the ascension of the passing game made Travon McMillian a bit of a casualty down the stretch. So not nearly as productive as a sophomore than he was as the featured guy as a freshman.
Yeah, he unfortunately was a casualty of the offense they're running at Virginia Tech this past season. A guy that, like you said, made a huge impact as a freshman, over 1,000 yards, the first 1,000-yard rusher since David Wilson in the 2011 season. So it had been quite some time since Virginia Tech had a rusher who had that big of a role in the offense. And a lot of that, of course, had to do with offensive line struggles in the previous few seasons as well. But having Travon McMillian back for the Hokies, it looked like a really big role for him was going to be in the works heading into his sophomore year, just given his skill set and how it perceived to be fitting with the Justin Fuente offense coming in year one. He had a huge game against Tennessee, but then we really didn't hear much from Travon McMillian after that until the Miami game, where he had a really good game against the Hurricanes as well. But Travon McMillian was kind of in and out of the running back rotation, and a lot of it seemed to be game plan oriented, less than the talent. I mean, the talent has always been there with Travon McMillian. He's always had the ability to make people miss. He's a local guy from my area that I saw play quite a bit in high school, and he's always kind of possessed an ability in the open field to have really good vision as a runner. He runs really well off of his blocks, a trait that you saw really well as a freshman. He was able to go out and make a lot of guys miss, and you know, that's the vision as a runner is something you don't always see very quickly in the jump from high school to college, but you saw it rather quickly with Travon McMillian, which is why a lot of Hokies fans were so high on him and remain high on him. But he's the incumbent running back at the position. I anticipate that he'll have a rather large role heading into next season, but just how many carries he'll get versus the rest of the group that they're going to be bringing in here in Blacksburg in 2017 kind of remains to be seen, because in a lot of ways it's very similar to what he kind of dealt with this past season. You know, the incumbent running back, 1,000-yard rusher, and heads into 2016-17 season and doesn't see nearly the amount of production that he saw as a freshman. So heading into the junior year, we'll hope that Travon McMillian kind of returns to form that he had as a freshman and hopefully turn in more efforts like he had against Tennessee and Miami rather than the other games the rest of the season where he didn't really make much of an impact at all.
Take the Clemson game out of the equation in the ACC championship game, and you mentioned McMillian's efforts against Tennessee and Miami, not necessarily the two best defenses that Virginia Tech faced during the regular season, but I would be willing to state that they're the two most talented defenses that Virginia Tech faced during the season, and those were his two biggest games. 14 carries for $127 against Tennessee, 18 carries for 131 against the Canes. Because there's little support behind him, because now we've got a new quarterback and we don't have the plethora of wide receiver talent, he's going to have to step it up, you would think, and be more of a factor in the running game as the Hokies rely more on the ground game. And he only caught 11 passes. He did catch 3 touchdowns out of the backfield, but you would think he would be more of an outlet in space that could be taken advantage of as well in the passing game. Now, Mike, we get to a lot of unknowns. We get to a few names that Hokie fans are not necessarily aware of unless they're recruiting junkies, because this guy, Jalen Holston, is a guy that was on a lot of people's radar out of the talent-rich state of Georgia.
Yeah, Jalen Holston's a stud, Mark, and he's a guy who could be a home run type back for Virginia Tech for years to come. You see it on film, the speed, the explosiveness out of the backfield, the ability in the open field. You know, a lot of times you look at high school film at these players and you look at it from a talent perspective, and they're much more talented than the other players on the field. But there's something about Holston that kind of makes him stand out. It's the quickness out of the backfield, the acceleration that he shows as well. The fact that he's running away from secondary players on his film. Generally when you have some guys in the secondary that run just as fast or faster than the running backs, when he's gaining speed and running away from those types of players, that you have a really special running back prospect. And I think that's what Jalen Holston is. He's one of the more underrated running backs, I believe, in the class of 2017, and a guy that the Hokies coaching staff is really excited to get out of Georgia, who I believe, if he doesn't even make an impact this coming season, I think he's definitely a guy that will fit in for years to come, a guy that will definitely carve out a role for himself in this offense, just given the fact that he's able to run the way he does and also catch some passes out of the backfield, which is an invaluable trait in Justin Fuente's offense. A couple of other guys that have kind of been around Blacksburg for a little while now that fans have been waiting to see play. At the top of the list has got to be Travon McMillian, 5'9", 180. He's going to be a redshirt sophomore. A guy that can fill the scat back role that Virginia Tech was kind of missing this past year. A guy can come out and just catch passes out of the backfield, be a third down back, give the quarterback an outlet, a safety valve when the play breaks down. McMillian can be that guy, and he's an absolute speedster. He can fly, and obviously at 5'9", you hope that he has that kind of speed to play at this level, and McMillian certainly does. So I think he can fulfill that role. And then another guy that kind of took a backseat to Sam Rogers, but he was on the receiving end of Sam Rogers' touchdown pass against Miami, is Stephen Peoples. And Stephen Peoples has been in the system for a while. He's a 5'10" fullback for Virginia Tech. I think he's the surefire candidate to replace Sam Rogers in the role that Sam had on the team, as a guy who can be a power back, but also be a pass blocking back as well in passing situations. You can bring him in. You can pair him up with a guy like Travon McMillian, a guy like Travon McMillian, even Jalen Holston out of the backfield if the Hokies choose that route on third downs, especially where you have to have an extra guy back there in pass protection. Stephen Peoples has shown in the past that he can fulfill that role when Sam Rogers wasn't in the game, and I think he'll have a bigger impact for the Hokies moving forward in that role.
Well, we definitely have a familiar name to talk about in Terius Wheatley. So if you're not a college football fan who's been around for a long, long time, you may not know about Terius's father, who played at Michigan, won a Rose Bowl, and I believe set the Rose Bowl rushing record at the time. This guy is rated the #1 athlete in the country, according to 247 Sports. So when we see that athlete designation next to a recruit, we don't know if they're going to go play cornerback or wide receiver. That's typically the slant on that particular player, but it looks like running back for Terius Wheatley.
Yeah, his dad, Travon Wheatley. Ladies and gentlemen, if you live under a rock and don't know who Travon Wheatley is, he's one of the greatest running backs in Michigan history, and we don't have to get into the history of Michigan football, but it's a long list of really, really good players to come out of that program. And Tyrone's son, Terius, is a stud as well. He's a 6', 185-pound running back, already looks the part. As you mentioned, Mark, he was listed as an athlete. He played running back, split out some at receiver, and played defensive back in high school. So he played all over the field, as a lot of these elite prospects do. But Terius would like to play running back at Virginia Tech. We'll see if he's actually cut out for that role. I think given his lineage, it's worth a freaking shot. When your father's Travon Wheatley, I think you can roll with running back for his son Terius. And we're going to see what happens here. He's shown great skills on film. Obviously, he's listed as the #1 athlete in the country, according to 24/7, for a reason. And he's a guy who can make an impact for the Hokies right away. Given the depth at running back, it'll be interesting to see if they think Terius Wheatley is ready to just throw right in the mix. If he is, I think that he's a guy who can make an impact right away, just given his size, speed, and athletic ability that he possesses already, and the fact that he doesn't need a redshirt year to put on some weight in the weight room. He's already got that build that you want out of a collegiate running back, if that's the path that the Hokies feel like he can take on as a collegiate player. So it'll be really interesting to see Terius Wheatley's development here moving forward for the Hokies, and hopefully he can make as big an impact as his father made at Michigan. If he does, Hokies fans will obviously be very, very happy.
Yeah, if he does about half as good as his dad, the Hokie fans will be very delighted in one Terius Wheatley. But the #1 rated athlete, according to 247, in all of high school football heading to the next level. Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC joining us to break down the Hokies at the running back position with Travon McMillian and a bunch of question marks, but a lot of talent to back him up in 2017. Mike, we appreciate the time.
All right. Thanks, Mark.